us quite right. Certainly, it gets some people upset. One pastor wrote that he was telling this parable one Sunday morning several years ago, and that when he was done preaching on this text, a church member came up to him and said, "You know, preacher, there are parts of the Bible that are difficult to abide and other parts that are not. The story you preached on today is one that I find totally offensive. It's just not fair to pay everyone the same wage when some people worked hard and some have hardly worked. Jesus was just wrong about that. I think you should have preached on something less offensive." Well, this minister said that the following Sunday, he preached on the prodigal son. Not exactly less offensive. This is a challenging parable. So let's take a deeper look at it to see what exactly is going on here. What we discover is that it's harvest time, and the landowner is looking for laborers to work in his vineyard to pick grapes. So, as was customary in that time, there would be people standing around in the marketplace looking for work, and different people would come around to hire them. So it's 6 o'clock in the morning, the landowner comes, he sees a bunch of people standing there, and so he hires them to begin working in his vineyard. And he agrees that he's going to pay them a full day's wage, which was a denarii. And a denarii was enough to feed a family for a day. So they're getting what was a very standard wage, a very fair wage. Well, as the day goes on, this landowner sees that he's going to need more workers. So he goes out at 9 a.m., he hires more workers. He goes out at noon, hires more workers. He goes out at 3 in the afternoon, hires still more workers. And he even goes out at 5 because he wants to get this harvest in, and he hires workers. And he simply tells them that he'll pay them what is fair. Well, at 6 p.m., he begins paying the workers, starting with the last hired. And the shock comes when everyone is paid the same. Whether they were hired at 6 a.m. or 5 p.m., they were all paid a day's wage. Now, you can imagine the grumbling that went on. Some would say, "This just isn't fair. Can you believe this guy? We've been working all day long, and yet we don't get any more than people who have only worked an hour." Now think of it in these terms. Suppose you agreed to work for $10 an hour, and you've worked all day long, so you get $120 at the end of the day. Sounds great. But then somebody who has worked for 1 hour gets $120. That's $120 an hour compared to the $10 you got paid. Who wouldn't have felt that it just wasn't fair? But note what the landowner says. He says, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others?" The landowner sure looked at things differently. Now, the key verse for us as we look at this parable is verse 1. For there it says, "For the kingdom of God, or for the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner." Jesus wants us to look at life through the eyes of God. He wants us to view things from God's perspective. And if we do so, what do we see? We see a God who is generous, like the landowner, and gives extravagantly to everyone. So let's put that in our context. God is generous to the saint and to the sinner. God is generous to the person who is very involved in the life of their church, doing all kinds of church work, and to the person who belongs to the church who does hardly anything. God is generous to those who give and give and give, and he's generous to those who don't give much of anything at all. God is generous to those who follow Jesus all their life long, serving him in a variety of capacities and loving him. And he's generous to that person who on their deathbed finally accepts Jesus into their life. All are welcome in God's kingdom. This parable goes against the grain, doesn't it? It kind of hurts to even hear it. You see, the problem is that we have a business mentality that dominates our lives. We have been taught you get out what you put in. Yet that didn't happen in the story. Some put in a whole lot more than others, and they didn't get out more than others. We think the later workers got something for practically nothing. So this parable challenges us not to look upon the kingdom of God or the church as a business model. And this is difficult for us. It goes against the grain for us to hear, the last shall be first. We don't like to hear that. And so we need to hear in this parable that we have a generous God who doesn't base his generosity on fairness, but on what helps his children. One person said that God is generous with his love and with his gifts to each and every one of us. Have you ever thought about how generous God is to you and how generous God is to me? Barbara Brown Taylor is an Episcopal priest and a very good writer. So she asks us some interesting questions. She asks, when we read this parable, why do we tend so immediately to identify with the folks hired at the crack of dawn? Why do we so readily assume that when the kingdom fully comes, we will be the ones tempted to feel upset in that we will also be shown to have been the hardest workers of them all? Who told you or me that we've been working for 12 hours? How do we know that just maybe our work totals the measly 1 hour after all? Gives us an interesting perspective. Taylor imagines that the 1 hour workers hooted with delight, ain't we the lucky ones? But she also pictures that on that final day, we'll be like that. And we'll say, ain't we the lucky ones? Indeed, God is generous, both to those who are deserving, if we can even say such a thing, as well as to those who are undeserving in our own minds. I'm not sure where we fit, but we do know that God is more generous than we deserve. Now, thus far, we've focused on God's generosity to us and others. But there's a question that I think is kind of in this for us as well. I mean, if you grew up in a church that taught a regular catechism or Sunday school, or I'm sure you've heard it from the pulpit many times, we are made in God's image, right? We are made in God's image. We are made so that we can imitate God. And so, if we are made in God's image, are we generous to others? Are we generous and gracious to others? There's an old parable told by a rabbi about a farmer who had 2 sons. And these 2 sons were raised to know all about growing crops and raising animals. Well, when the father got too old to work, the 2 boys took over the chores of the farm, and when this old farmer died, these 2 boys found that working together was so meaningful that they continued their partnership. So each brother contributed what he could, and during every harvest season, they would divide equally what they had produced. Across the years, the elder brother never married, but the younger brother did, and he had 8 children. Some years later, when they were having a wonderful harvest, the single brother one night thought to himself, "My brother has 10 mouths to feed. I only have 1. He really needs more of this harvest than I do. But I know that he is much too fair to renegotiate. I know what I'll do. In the dead of night, when he is already asleep, I'll take some of what I have and put it in his barn, and I'll slip it into his barn so that he can help feed his children." At the same time, the younger brother was thinking, "God has given me these wonderful children. My brother hasn't been so fortunate. He really needs more of this harvest for his old age than I do. But I know him. He's much too fair. He'll never renegotiate. I know what I'll do. In the dead of night, when he's asleep, I'll take some of what I have in my barn and I'll slip it into his barn." And so one night, when the moon was full, these 2 brothers came face to face, each on a mission of generosity. The old rabbi said there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and yet a gentle rain began to fall. And it was God weeping for joy because 2 of his children had come to realize that generosity is the deepest characteristic of the holy. Because we are made in God's image, being generous is the secret to our joy as well. Sometimes it just isn't fair. I wouldn't be surprised if every one of us today could think of an instance, even right now, where something just doesn't seem fair in our lives. So we know what that is like. Yet, when it comes to God's generosity, all of us benefit, whether we're deserving or not. And so we can rejoice in God's generosity. And at the same time, because we are made in God's image, we can extend that generosity to others. May we do so in the name of our gracious and generous God. Amen.